Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Letters from the Ancient World. In this episode, we go into prehistory to answer the question, where did the Greeks and the Romans come from? The key to answering this question lies in language. As those who study the languages rapidly realise, Latin and Greek are closely related. It's pretty clear, for example, that the Latin word for carry, ferro, fers, fert, is related to the Greek equivalent, ferro, feres, fere. For a long time, no one really understood what the relationship was. The breakthrough came in the 1500s. Jesuit missionaries in India discovered Sanskrit, an ancient scholarly language which plays a similar role in Hinduism to that played by Latin in Catholicism. It became obvious that Sanskrit was related to Latin and Greek. Other such discoveries followed, and by the late 18th century, a new academic field of inquiry had been born, Indo-European studies. The premise of the new discipline was that the languages of Europe and northern India are nearly all related, sprung from some common source, as the English scholar Sir William Jones famously put it in 1786. The common source has become known as Proto-Indo-European, or PIE for short. To illustrate how it works, let's take the word father in some Indo-European languages, and, for contrast, the same word in some unrelated languages. There's no question that the words in the first group are related, while the words in the second group aren't. The same trick can be repeated for literally thousands of other words. Between the attested languages known to scholars and the lost language of PIE, there seem to have been intermediate daughter languages of PIE. For example, English, German and Norwegian are thought to descend from PIE via a Proto-Germanic language, Irish and Welsh via Proto-Celtic, and so on. For a long time, it was thought that there was a major division between Western and Eastern Indo-European languages. This was known as the Kentum-Satem split, from the words for hundred in Latin and Sanskrit. However, the remains of an extinct Indo-European language known as Tocharian were discovered in China in the early 20th century. In spite of its easterly location, this proved to be a Kentum language. This is the sort of discovery that comparative linguists find very exciting. Almost as exciting was the decipherment, at around the same time, of the ancient Middle Eastern language known as Hittite. It turned out not only that this was a member of the Indo-European family, but also that it preserves some particularly ancient linguistic features from PIE. The early reconstructions of PIE made it look very like Sanskrit. Modern reconstructions use technical phonetic notation, which makes it look closer to Klingon. This is not as obscure as it looks, however. The first word, hovis, is the word for sheep, and is connected with the Latin ovis and the English ovine. Similarly, the term equans means horse and is related to equus and equine. Don't forget, PIE is only a reconstruction, put together on a best guess basis. Many aspects of the language are still unclear. We can't tell how far the Indo-European people themselves would have recognised PIE in the form currently put forward by scholars. Where and when was PIE spoken? No one really knows, except that it must have been before around 2000 BC, which is when the first historical texts of languages descended from PIE start to appear. The most plausible guesses for the time period are somewhere in or around the 3000s BC, although PIE would have been spoken for a long time and would itself have evolved. Where PIE originated has been a source of controversy ever since the discovery of PIE itself. For a long time, scholars thought that it was possible to pin down the location by reconstructing the words for geographical features, flora and fauna, and then seeing which areas in Europe and Western Asia possessed the items in question. 50 years ago, it might have been plausible to argue in the following way. There are reconstructible PIE words for salmon, beech tree and eel. The beech tree, Fagus sylvatica, is native to Central and Eastern Europe. and the salmon and eel are found in the Baltic Sea, but not in or around the Black Sea. So pie must have originated in Eastern Europe, near the Baltic coast, mustn't it? Not necessarily. There are several problems with this method. Most obviously, we can't be sure exactly where particular plants and animals were to be found several thousand years ago. We also can't know precisely what the Indo-Europeans meant by the reconstructed terms. By salmon, did they mean the Atlantic salmon, which is native to Europe, or the salmon trout, which is native to Asia? By beach, are we sure that they meant Fagus sylvatica and not another species? There are other problems with such arguments too, which we needn't go into here. But there is one intriguing clue of this kind which may be genuinely significant. There is no reconstructible pie word for sea. It's much easier to say where the Indo-European homeland wasn't than where it was. We can be fairly confident that it wasn't in Western Europe or in India, but that still leaves an enormous expanse of territory, from Eastern Europe to southern Russia via Turkey and Iran. There's a persistent theory that the homeland was located among the steppes of southern Russia. This theory is as likely as any to be true. Even if we can't reliably locate things like beech trees and salmon on the map, reconstructing items of vocabulary can give us interesting insights into the Indo-European social world. If we can reconstruct a term in pie, the concept which it refers to must have been known to the speakers of pie. We can discover quite a bit about the Indo-Europeans and their society using this method. They were not especially primitive people. We're not talking about cavemen here. They were farmers who lived in settled villages. They wore woolen clothes and used wheeled vehicles and ceramic vessels. The horse was culturally important to them. They worshipped a pantheon of gods headed by a sky father, Zou Pater in Greek, Jupiter in Latin. The pie vocabulary has a lot of reconstructible words that may refer to fighting, and this has been used to suggest that they were a warlike people. Their poets seem to have sung about the glorious deeds of heroes, just as Homer and Indian epic poets did in later times. This video would not be complete without a reference to the political use and abuse of the Indo-European theory. During the 19th and 20th centuries, Indo-European studies became bound up with fashionable ideas of racial supremacy, and our Indo-European ancestors were sometimes seen as being a kind of master race, the original Aryans. There was a crossover between Indo-European research and the political hard right, in the form both of traditionalist conservatives like Georges Dumézil and outright Nazi sympathisers like Jan de Vries. Some neo-Nazis have continued to promote an old theory that the Indo-Europeans came from the North Pole, the whitest place of all. There's sometimes a fine line between reconstructing ancient societies and recreating them in our own image.